Good evening and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jane Myers, Director of Parish Life for Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to have you all here with us tonight for our third in a series entitled Multiplying Our Images of God. As you know, this is co-sponsored between Bellarmine Chapel and the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice on Xavier's campus. Before we begin this evening's presentation, I'd like to share a little bit of the background just to give some context for this series for those of you joining us for the first time. The series was put together as part of our focus on active discipleship and has been coordinated by members of our social mission core team, our worship core team, and staff, including myself and Tim Severin, in collaboration with our theological partners at the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. Originally, we convened to discuss the need to multiply our images of God beyond traditional masculine images like Father, King, and Lord, as found in much of Catholic prayer and liturgy. As the team continued talking, however, we recognized there were still bigger questions that we wanted to explore together to expand our own understanding of God. The hope is that by multiplying our images of God, that is, by understanding how different traditions within and outside Catholicism understand and talk about God using both human and more than human terms, that our individual and community life would be enriched. The lecture series is not meant to make any particular proclamation about the nature of God, but rather to spur dialogue around these topics, and the series will culminate in a mini retreat next spring. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, let me share a few logistics just to review. We will keep you all on mute during the presentation. Our two speakers will each present for 30 minutes, and then we will go into our breakout rooms for small group discussion, followed by question and answer. If you have questions for either of our presenters, we ask you to type them into the chat when we're in the full group setting. The questions will go directly to Tim, who will collate these for our Q&A at the end of the evening. And I will pose the questions to our speakers at that time. Because we do have two presenters this evening, we'd like to extend our time a little bit to allow sufficient time for each of them. So we plan to conclude at 8:45 this evening. If any of you needs to sign off at 8:30, please feel free to do that. But we'd like to give those few extra moments for discussion tonight. I'd like to introduce our two presenters now. Leon Chartrand received a PhD from the University of Toronto in environmental theological ethics. He specializes in phenomenology, eco-spirituality, and Native American lifeways and shamanic practices. Leon is a seasoned wilderness guide and the founding director of Xavier Expeditions, now in its 12th year, and he has so far guided Xavier students on 45 expeditions from Africa to the Arctic. Professor Juan J. Herr is an assistant professor of comparative theology at Xavier. His research includes Indo-Tibetan Buddhism and Christian theology, body and religion, contemplative traditions, and interreligious dialogue. Because both presentations this evening will take us beyond our Judeo-Christian tradition, we invite you to be particularly open-minded and open-hearted to receive the wisdom that our presenters will share with us tonight. So I think with that, We can begin, yes. Leon, welcome and go ahead.
Thank you, Jane, Donna, Tim, Wanje, and Ashley with ISSJ for organizing this. And thank you to all of you for your interest. And I look forward to any questions. So what I'd like to start out with is, with over 500 tribes on this continent in particular, and the various language groups, it becomes a real challenge for 30 minutes, let alone to do justice to those cultures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two in particular that you might be familiar with a little different take that you might not be familiar with an emphasis on seeing that there's real depth. I tend to start off my classes with a greeting, and the greeting is Mutakuyepi Shante Washtanda Pestu Zapi. And that means I shake your hand with a happy heart, knowing that we're on Zoom. And that is a formal way of greeting a group. The other phrase gets to the heart of a worldview that is Lakota. And this is something that I teach the students the very first day as well. And the phrase is Unchi Hekiwakan Mish Ea Heam Mawakanyelo. And what that means is Unchi Hekiwakan, Mother Earth, she is holy. Mish Ea Heam Mawakanyelo, I too, for this reason, am holy. The word waka, probably most people would be familiar with the term wakan tanka, which is the general term for, often literally understood as, the Great Spirit. And that term tends to be, it's been anglicized, but it's through the Abrahamic tradition's interpretation. And what I want to do is look at just the word waka, which is often thought of as the holy or spirit. Waka is two words combined. Wa means something that is. Ka means very old, but more specifically, it is a word for old in reference to something that is alive. So there are other words like tanila, which means old, like your desk is old. But to be alive means, it could also refer to a rock. So when something is waka, it is something that is old, that is also very alive. So when we say Unshiha Kiwakan, it means Mother Earth, she is very old and alive. I too, for this reason, am holy. If I were to say, Mishea Ehan Mawakanyelo, I too am very old and alive. Meaning my story, my life goes began way before my birth. That there's something ancient in me. And so that is it's a little bit of a glimpse into a worldview. And what I'd like to do is to approach indigenous cultures. Theology can produce challenges. Phenomenology is rooted in the human experience with the landscape, with the world around us, with things, and how those impact the human in our experiences. And when we approach through experiences and we listen to stories about the landscape that we might be experiencing, a whole new world opens up where we start to see truths and facts in a story rather than beliefs or opinions. If I were to tell a story of characters, it might, when we hear it just at face value, if we hear it, we might actually think, this is unbelievable. I mean, but we forget that we have a serpent in Genesis. And so when there are animals that show up in stories, they're often metaphors for something else. For instance, among the Navajo, one word that often gets perceived as if Navajo people are fundamentalists is the word naye'e, which means monster. Now, there's a story a long time ago, part of the creation, in several worlds. Around the time of the third world, the people were not getting along. Part of that was stemmed by, there were first man and first woman. They were there from the beginning, the very first world, and moving on to the second and then to the third world. First man is thinking there's something not right with first woman. She might be cheating on him. And soon he discovers that she has had an affair with Turquoise Boy, who eventually becomes the son. He gets upset. He goes and quiets himself, and he becomes secluded by himself in his hogan for 4 days, and people are concerned. He comes out with an edict. We're going to separate. They lived here at the time where the rivers crossed, and so all the women would be on one side of the river and all the men would be on the other. And so they would be separated. As time went on, they grew to miss each other, and that manifested itself in ugly ways. The women did not have any interaction with the men didn't have interaction with the women. To keep this, because anyway, this resulted in the birth of monsters. And these monsters, eventually, when they became of age, they went around eating people, turning people to stone, and so forth. Now, when you hear that story, it sounds unbelievable. It really does. But that would be built upon the perception that the story is meant to be understood literally. But that story had to happen for the story eventually to come about, where one of the most significant holy people among the Navajo, or Dene, is Changing Woman. Changing Woman is found as an infant on a mesa called Choli'i, and first man and first woman hear her crying, and they see this rainbow and this bright light out into the east. And first man attempts to go find out where this crying is coming from several times. And on the fourth time, he eventually makes it to the top, and he finds this little infant. He brings her back, and they raise her, and she has her first ceremony to become a woman eventually. And there are other holy people that come and participate in her development and so forth. She eventually becomes a woman, and moving eastward, walking, she meets the sun, who's disguised as this beautiful stallion. And this stallion and her get together, and she feels something moving inside her, and she gives birth to twins 9 days later. And these twins are Monster Slayer and Born for Water. Now, if we think about those names, Monster Slayer, it has an implication of destroyer. Born for Water has an implication for creator. And the twins, there it is right there, that there's the power of destruction and creation right there in that moment of these two twins being born. And as they get older, they meet with their father, who is the sun, and he teaches them, he gives them lightning arrows and a thunder bow, teaches them how to hunt these monsters, and they do. And they kill them left and right. The Naye'e are almost gone, with the exception of the ones that talk them out of it. And the monsters that talk them out of it are poverty, death, old age, illness, addiction, depression, so forth. The monsters that survive because they show why they're worthwhile to be around. That story is really more about the experience as human beings of the monsters we all have to slay within us, or the monsters that are present around us in our world. This is the power of the metaphor of those stories. So when I look at these cultures, I see them as essential for our world today. And the reason I see them as essential for our world today is because there are perspectives about the human relationship with the landscape that is much needed. And the reason I think it's much needed is, am I running out of time? Let's see. How much time do I have left, Donna?
You have lots of time, 20 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay. So before I get there, let me give you some examples of how things might be perceived through that lens. One might be the word waka, which means it's reference to river, and wa, which is like waka. Wa means something that is, and pa means everlasting. So the idea of naming a river, the river is meant to be something everlasting, has a perception that the river is very old, for one, and will continue to be. Another one is a word, inilaya. Inilaya are 3 words. Ini means life, la means very, and ya means to make. And the interesting thing is inilaya is the word for silence. Now, if I understand this word inilaya as literally life and very, to make, in other words, to make much life, it offers an opportunity to, why is silent? Why is this the word for silence? And it has to do with life is silent. It's everywhere. And to understand what life is requires listening, trying to hear it, trying to open up to it. And by opening up to it, we start to realize that how we learn to be on this landscape is from everything around us. Everything around us has a knowledge about how we are to be. So there are variations in which the idea of God is named in the Lakota worldview traditionally. Of course, there is the word wakantanka, which is tob kin. It's also referred to as the Great Spirit, or a God in 16 forms, essentially. And another word is tunkashila, grandfather. But another word is unchi, which is grandmother or Mother Earth. Now, these terms, grandfather, tunkashila, can be used to my grandfather, but it can also be used in reference to Father Sky or Grandfather Sky. My grandmother, I can say unchi, but I can also, in reference to Mother Earth, and say unchi for Mother Earth. Other terms I might think of is like we is the sun, hanwi is the moon, takuskanskan, it's the sky, which literally means something that's moving. Tate is the wind. There's a whole bunch. And then there's Wope, who's known as falling star. And she's the daughter of sun and moon in the stories. And eventually she falls to the earth and she becomes White Buffalo Calf Woman. There are perceptions on soul that it's not necessarily that we, Lakota, believe that you have one soul, that you actually have 4. But if we understand what those names for souls reference, we actually have words for those or terms for them, but we've secularized them. So for instance, there's the word niya, which is the life presence in us, which we might think of in a secular sense as just life. There's the word naji, and naji is what we might think of as our soul. And that we might think of as the Christian perspective of soul. That's kind of associated with our individuality. Najila is like your gut. It's literally little ghost. And the little ghost is the one who knows the way to the land of the souls. And if you are not on the, if you are not on what's called the red road, or you die in a state of, not in a state of peace and don't go through a ceremony, your Najila goes away. And so a ceremony is held to bring back your little ghost so that the Najila can take you to the land of the souls. The fourth is Situn. It's literally means power. It is when we have experiences with things, we acquire power from those things, but they acquire power from us. And it does have an impact on us. In particular, if I go on a vision quest and I, for instance, I have, on my fourth day of my vision, I encounter a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear's power becomes part of me. It's not a theft. It's just I adopt some of that strength as part of me. And these are essentially what's known as the four souls. It's not quite the same in the Navajo. The Navajo believe in what's known as Nilchi'i, and it is often the little squirrely line, a spiral, is often the symbol for Nilchi'i. And Nilchi'i is like the, we might have a word energy. It's in everything. And we also have this animating power that's given to us by the holy people, meaning the Diyin Dene, that is known as Bigisti'i. And that holy, or that animating power, is essentially what our soul is. But when we die in the Navajo, our soul, or our energy, returns back to earth and re-energizes or brings life to other things. And so there's a difference between these two cultures, quite a bit. One has the land of the souls, or the happy hunting ground. The Navajo don't talk about the dead. The dead reanimate the world around us. And if we look at the way in which the Navajo world, and including the stories, the path, I guess you could say, that they follow, from a first world to a second world, to a third world, to a fourth world, to this current world, that there's an understanding that all things, even knowledge, is gained and eventually is lost. And there's a period of renewal. All things are born, live, and die. And there's a period of renewal. It's not reincarnation. It's the idea that we become an identity. We come into existence from some level of non-existence, you might say, or this sense of energy, but then we return back to it. And we lose our sense of self. Okay, let's see. Well, I guess touching on, there's also the Ojibwe culture, and the Ojibwe culture has what's known as, the creator's name is Kichi Manitou. And Kichi is great, Manitou is spirit. But Manitou is similar to the notion of waka in Lakota. And it's the idea, or it's the sense that Manitou is an imponderable essence, a withinness, you might say, or a numinous presence that's in things. The river can be Manitou. A tree can be Manitou. And that Manitou does have something to do with how old it is, its story, what it comes from, what significance it has. It's due to experiences that people have had with it in the past. Say it's a tree that had some significant role in a ceremony years ago that still is considered Manitou. People can be Manitou, just like we can be considered waka. We can also be considered Manitou. The last thing I would bring up, and I think this is actually a parallel between a commonality between Navajo, Ojibwe, and Lakota, has to do with what's known as complementary opposition. And I can kind of tell it like in the form of a brief story. At the time when the creator was, after he had had his vision and he had started to create the world around him and eventually the animals, he came to the point where he was going to create Anishinaabe, the two-legged. And he wanted to give the two-legged a special gift, but he didn't want the two-legged to receive it until he and she was ready. So he gathered all the animals together and he said, I'm going to create the two-legged and I'm going to give the two-legged a special gift, but I don't want them to receive it until they're ready. Where shall I hide this gift? And so the first to speak up was the bear, which was the master of the animal nation. And he said, give it to me. I'll climb up to the highest mountain, find a cave and put it in there. Surely he and she won't find it there. And the creator said, no, one day they'll get there before they're ready. The owl said, give it to me. I'll put it up on the moon. And as if a foreshadowing, the creator said, no, Anishinaabe will be able to get to the moon before he or she's ready to receive it. And the eagle said, give it to me. I'll put it in the sky and the clouds. And the salmon said, give it to me. I'll take it down the stream and down the river and into the big waters and put it at the bottom of the sea. And the creator said, no, Anishinaabe will find it before he or she's ready. All the animals spoke. And in divine time, this would have been thousands of years. But this was days, or, I mean, in human time, it's been thousands of years, but days in divine time. And the last to speak up was this meek little vole who was said to be blind with physical eyes because tunnels under the ground, but not with spiritual eyes. And the vole says, put it inside them. And so the creator said, he thought about it, he thought about it, he thought about it, he thought about it 4 times, which is a sacred number. And he said, it's done. That is the gift that many believe the human was granted by the creator. The power to dream and seek visions, the power of creative imagination. All the other animals, for instance, have better gifts than us. We're generalists. And in that sense, if we think about what is that power, and we look at it from the standpoint of how the Navajo, the Lakota, and the Ojibwe share this interesting perspective on the human being. And that is the human being, gender aside, has a power in us. That power can sometimes be utilized for great creativity. And it can also be used for great destructiveness. Now, through the Christian lens, we might look at that as good and evil. But through these 3 cultural lenses, it's actually ecological, because inevitably every one of us here have to, at times, be destructive. If we ate dinner tonight, that's a destructive act. It doesn't justify going out and doing destructive things to other people. But what it does is it justifies the need for ceremonies. Because, for instance, if I'm Navajo and I'm a hunter, I normally would go through what's known as a blessing way ceremony. But before I go hunt, I go through what's known as the lightning way or the shooting way ceremony. And that shooting way ceremony highlights my destructive capacity to hunt. And after I hunt, and I bring the animal back, I need to return and go through a blessing weight ceremony to bring me back in balance. If I am a woman and I am going through the stage of giving birth to a child, what greater creativity a human being can do as an individual. I go through a ceremony before the birth that highlights that power of that life, that creative moment. But there's such a thing as too much creativity. So after birth, I need to return to a blessing way ceremony and tamp down my creative abilities. It's the idea of balance is a little trivial or a romanticized view of it. It's really more of a creative tension, that the human being is always in creative tension. And it's rooted in this notion of creativity and destructiveness, and not so much in good and evil. It doesn't mean that there's not good and evil. It just means that the human understands that, and I'll close with this, the person who perceives a wolf, a pack of wolves taking down elk, and the wolf is doing a destructive act. But there's a creativity out of that allows the wolves to live another day. It has something to do with the way in which wolves test and which animal they take and how that benefits the herd. Yeah, this is a slippery slope in our world today, but this is where it comes from, rather than good and evil. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you so much. There's a lot there for us to sort through. We can do that a little bit later. Juan Jay, are you ready to lead us into Buddhism? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, the whole team who put this event together. And thank you, Leon, for that wonderful talk. It's really, really kind of chewing on so many of the things that you've talked about. So I'm grateful for that. And thanks to everybody who's here tonight. May I share my screen? Because I have a slide. Okay. Okay, does everybody see the slides? Okay, great. So I'm talking about images of the holy for ultimate reality from the perspective of Buddhist traditions. And I want to begin by just pointing out three major forms of Buddhist tradition. So, and let me just put all of them on the slide so that you can look at them. So here, the very first one, you have the early tradition, which I'm going to refer to as the Pali tradition. And this is the tradition that formed soon after the Buddha's death, or in the Buddhist tradition, his final passing into nirvana or parinirvana. And that tradition continues today through what's called the Theravada tradition. And Theravada Buddhism is predominant in countries like Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, and Thailand. And it's also taken root here in America and in Europe more in more recent times. Then we have a later form of Buddhism called the Mahayana tradition, which literally means the great vehicle. And this is something that comes into emergence sometime around the 1st century of the Common Era. And Mahayana forms of Buddhism are predominant in China, Tibet, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and in India, present time India. Some may have heard of the term Hinayana to draw a distinction between the Mahayana. So some people used to call the early Buddhist tradition as preserved in the Theravada Hinayana, but Hinayana is actually a pejorative term that's used by Mahayana apologetics. It means the smaller vehicle, and we'll kind of unpack that later on in the presentation, why it's called these things. So I just want to point out that that's actually an incorrect form to refer to the early Pali tradition. Then finally, the last kind of the latecomer, or the last kind of form of Buddhism to emerge of the major schools is called the Vajrayana tradition. And that's a tantric form of Buddhism that has its own kind of distinct set of practices and perspectives. And it's a sub-tradition of the Mahayana tradition. So just to introduce that, the fact that there are these major traditions within Buddhism, and it's quite very diverse. Now, in talking about images of the holy from the Buddhist perspective, we have to begin with the fact that the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, rejected the notion of any kind of an absolute divine being. And his rejection of an all-powerful creator God is part of his kind of larger teaching on the non-existence of a permanent self in living beings. And this is presented, and I have to begin here just because the way that Buddhism approaches ultimate reality is so different from traditions like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, kind of the major theistic traditions. And this teaching about the lack of self is presented in the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, I can't go through all of them, obviously, but I'm just going to point out a couple salient points here. The Four Noble Truths are the core teachings, that make up the foundation of all schools of Buddhism. And in this teaching, the historical Buddha says that what we take to be myself, an I, a me, an identity, what we take to be a self is actually made up of impermanent and constantly changing parts. And ordinarily, we feel that there's some kind of permanent thing that's called a me, somewhere that's part of my mind and body, yet distinct from it. But on closer inspection, this sense of an I turns out to be a construct of thought, something that we impose upon a reality that is constantly changing and passing away, and comprised of many, many different parts. Now, ironically, why do we do that? I'm sorry, I should explain first, why do we do this? Well, from the Buddhist perspective, we do this, we create a sense of self unconsciously, because at a deep level, we're very scared of the fact that things are constantly passing away, and we desire a lasting sense of security and happiness. And so we cling on to something that we think is permanent, which is a sense of me, to kind of ward off our anxiety about a world that's constantly in flux. Now, ironically, the very attempt to secure this kind of happiness by clinging on to a sense of a firm, lasting identity leads to suffering and sense of dissatisfaction. And why is that? Well, because we're looking for permanent satisfaction by holding on to something that is by nature impermanent. So how can I hold on to something that's impermanent and expect that to give me permanent satisfaction and security? It's not possible. Yet we're caught in the delusion that I am real, and that if I hold on to a sense of self and whatever supports and give pleasure to my sense of self, I will find some kind of permanent sense of happiness, security, and peace. And so this is kind of the Buddhist perspective, that this is a delusion, this is the ignorance in which we're all caught, that we do not realize the nature of reality as impermanent, and that we're caught up in a constant hankering after objects of satisfaction, which in fact only deepen our suffering and leads to endless disappointment. Now, according to the Buddha, everything that exists, and in fact the entire realm of existence, are created through this ignorance, this capacity to kind of impute permanent, real existence when there actually isn't any. And this is connected to the teaching, and I'm not going to go into it in any depth here, but just to point out, this is connected to the teaching in the Noble Truth teachings on the idea of dependent origination, where ignorance is presented as the fundamental cause and condition that leads to endless cycle of rebirth and redeath. So in the Buddhist tradition, just to kind of make this a little bit maybe clear, in the Buddhist tradition, everything that comes into existence does so not because there is a creator God, right? That's making this stuff. Everything comes into existence because there's at root some kind of ignorance about impermanence and selflessness, and a very deep tendency to cling on to something. And that generates phenomena, that generates form, that generates consciousness. And it places us in various types of realms of existence where we suffer. This is actually called samsara. And the cosmology in Buddhism says that we're endlessly becoming born, we suffer, we die, and we become reborn, and we suffer and we die because of this ignorance and clinging attachment to things that are impermanent. And here in the picture, you'll see depicted various realms in the form of a circle. And this represents this kind of cycle of rebirth and redeath, samsara. And here is the human realm, just to point out, here is the divine realm, and here are the demigods, realm of the demigods. And here are the ghost realms. Below is the hell realm, and in the left bottom corner is the animal realm. 6 different realms in which one can be reborn into. And as long as we're caught up in ignorance, we're always going to be reborn in this. Well, so if this is this is a very bleak picture, is this all there is then, from a Buddhist perspective? What then counts as ultimate reality? Is it only a negative absence of, permanent existence? No, that's not the only thing that the Buddha says. In the Noble Truth, the third Noble Truth, the Buddha says that there is this thing called nirvana. It's a dimension of reality that is completely free from greed, from hatred, from ignorance. There's no suffering in this dimension of reality. It lies outside of any conditions or change, and we can realize this truth, this reality of nirvana in this body and in this mind, when we have gotten rid of all of our ignorance and gotten rid of all of our clinging attachment. Now, and here is a famous passage from a text called the Udana, where the Buddha talks about this, and he's speaking to an assembly of monks, and he says, there is, monks, an unborn, something that's not fabricated, unoriginated, unmade, and unconditioned, meaning it's not subject to anything else. And what's interesting about this passage, in the rest of it, he says, were there not the unborn, unoriginated, unmade, and so forth, there would be no escape from the born, unoriginated, made, and conditioned. Meaning, if there wasn't some realm or some dimension of reality that is truly free of suffering and ignorance, there would not be the possibility of escaping this realm of suffering, this realm of change and instability. So nirvana is a condition for the possibility of liberation from samsaric existence. And the Buddha refrained from discussing nirvana in any kind of theoretical way because he said it transcends all language. It transcends any concept and any form of existence. And for Christians, this may remind you of the apophatic tradition that's articulated by people like Gregory of Nyssa or Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, who talk about God as a reality that's beyond even being itself, a reality that cannot be captured or expressed in human words in any kind of complete sense. It is analogous in that sense. Now, the Buddha, although he didn't theorize or speculate about what nirvana is, he did say that it has these qualities. So in this slide, I put some of these qualities that he mentions. Whatever nirvana is, it's peaceful, it's deathless, sublime, secure, unailing. He also says it's like a shelter, a refuge. And the nirvana, the word itself, nirvana, has one meaning of to extinguish, right? To get rid of all causes of suffering. But it's hard to understand, he says, it's hard to see. And what's interesting is it's not something that you can attain by reason, meaning your intellect here is kind of not of any use. It's only to be experienced directly. Okay, so in Buddhist teaching then, in the early tradition, I don't want to go at too much length on just on the early tradition, but let me just kind of summarize. Ultimate reality in the early tradition is considered to be something that exists beyond samsara. But its portrayal of nirvana, this dimension that's free and utterly transcendent, is not anything like a Christian God. There is no divine being here. There's no divine agency here. And there's no understanding or notion of creation or preservation, right? It's not a supernatural power that's doing something in the world. That is not how nirvana is understood. So the analogy can only go so far. So in terms of how people relate, and this is where I really want to get into some images in the early tradition of the Buddha, then how do people relate to this thing? Well, the primary way, just in terms of actual practice, is to walk the path that the Buddha taught. In the fourth noble truth, he sets out what's called the eightfold path. And it's a path where you engage in ethical actions and concentration through meditation and acquiring insight into how things truly are, the true nature of reality through direct experience. And when we walk this path, we're really in touch with what the Buddhist tradition calls the Dharma body, the truth body of the Buddha, which he himself realized and embodied in his own person.
Wanje, you're halfway through.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And this is, so in the Buddhist early tradition, they say that the Buddha has two types of bodies. The body of his teachings, right, that he exemplified and passed on to his community and which lives on in the practitioners. And then the Buddha's physical body, which remains after his death through relics. And so this is kind of understanding of how the Buddha is present and how people relate to the ultimate reality that he embodied. Another way in which Buddhists relate to the ultimate and the holy is through the images of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha himself. And so we see here two pretty early examples of Shakyamuni Buddha from Sarnath in northern India, sometime around the 3rd century of the Common Era. Here we have a colossal Buddha that's been carved out of a rock, a face of a rock wall in Sri Lanka, sometime around the 12th century of the Common Era. And so these Buddhist statues, or the statue of the Buddha, are meant to kind of not just artistically represent the Buddha, but to actually bring into presence the Buddha himself, and more importantly, not the historical person so much, but the truth that he embodied in his person. In terms of relics, parts of the body of the Buddha, historical Buddha, that were distributed across the world, they were preserved in structures called stupas, and here is a very famous one called stupa in Sanchi in India. It goes back to the 3rd century of BCE. It's a part of the Buddha's physical remains after his death is, understood to be preserved within the center of this structure. Here is a much more of a recent example of this. It is a temple in Korea. Here you see a little tower on the right bottom hand of the slide here. This is a small stupa, and a part of the Buddha's remains is understood to be stored here. And this structure that's next to it looks onto this stupa, and you can see that there is an altar. Traditionally, there is a Buddhist image here, an image of the Buddha that would sit here. But in this particular shrine, there's a clear window because it's looking at the stupa. So these are means by which the Buddha's presence, not just the person, as I said, but the reality of nirvana that he himself embodied. These are ways in which Buddhists relate to that ultimate reality. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to a later form of Buddhism, the Mahayana tradition. I'm just going to give bits and pieces of the Mahayana perspective on ultimate reality and look at some images. The Mahayana tradition develops in the 1st century of the Common Era, and it has several, it has many differences from the early Pali tradition. Just to name a few, in the early tradition, the final goal was to attain individual nirvana by cutting away all ignorance and clinging attachment. The Mahayana comes along and says, that's no longer good enough. True Buddhists or superior Buddhists, let's say, should attain not just for their individual liberation from samsara, but they should strive to become like the Buddha himself, meaning they should become full-fledged Buddhas. Now, what's the difference between somebody who attains individual nirvana and somebody who attains full Buddhahood? The difference is somebody who attains full Buddhahood does so in order to help all living beings attain nirvana. So it's a greater scope in terms of the goal. You have an altruistic intention not only to work for your own freedom, but the freedom of all living beings. And it's like understood to be a much more arduous and a difficult path. But the Mahayana makes that the standard goal, while the Pali early tradition says individual nirvana should be the standard goal. I hope that makes sense. Now, this gets translated into an interesting kind of teaching. So here I'm just saying that in the early tradition, the preferred goal is nirvana, individual nirvana, often called arhatship, not becoming a full Buddha. While in the Mahayana tradition, complete enlightenment as a Buddha to help liberate all sentient beings becomes the main goal. Now, the person who vows, right, who generates the aspiration to become a full Buddha and vows to do so and actually pursues that complete enlightenment is called a bodhisattva, right? And in the Mahayana tradition, there develops a very rich tradition and set of images and devotional figures who are considered to be high-level bodhisattvas, who are on varying levels of attaining full Buddhahood. And the higher they go, the more power they gain to help all living beings. Now, let me just give you some examples of these kinds of high-level bodhisattvas that are at work across all realms of existence to aid sentient beings and to free them from suffering. This bodhisattva that we see here is called Avalokiteshvara. Literally, that word means the Lord who looks upon. And what that signifies is compassion, one who looks upon all living beings with compassion in their suffering. What's interesting is if you see the imagery here, you see this, what looks like a big circle with several layers in it. These are actually thousands of hands and arms. So this version or this image of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, has 1,000 hands. Why? Because he or she, the gender is actually fluid. This Bodhisattva manifests as a male or a female form. It doesn't, depending on the situation. But with 1,000 hands, this Bodhisattva can reach out and help innumerable sentient beings. So that's the meaning. And if you see, this Bodhisattva also has multiple heads, faces, like a tower of faces above the main face. You have one face here, you have two faces on the side, and one assumes that there's a face in the back as well. And then there are other faces on top of that. Well, why does this Bodhisattva have so many faces? In order to look in all directions, so that she or he can look upon them with compassion and be aware of those who are suffering, right? So that she or he can be of help to them. So this bodhisattva becomes very popular across Mahayana schools, and this is a Chinese kind of version of Avalokiteshvara called Kuan Yin, and the Chinese word Kuan Yin literally means to hear, to perceive sound. Well, what does that mean? It means to perceive the sound of the cry of those who suffer, right? And this posture of the bodhisattva is one of listening intently for those who are suffering. Another bodhisattva is Manjushri, which is a bodhisattva of wisdom, and he usually has a set of texts, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, over his shoulder, and then in his other hand usually has a sword, symbolizing the sharpness of wisdom. There's also this understanding that in Mahayana tradition, especially the Tibetan tradition, bodhisattvas are constantly, high-level bodhisattvas are constantly being reborn in our world. And here is an example here, who is the Dalai Lama. That he himself is actually an emanation of Avalokiteshvara. And Avalokiteshvara, a high-level bodhisattva like that, can emanate multiple infinite bodies, infinite forms across realms of existence, if that can be beneficial to other living beings. Now, another difference between the early tradition and the Mahayana tradition is this teaching on emptiness. And emptiness, the teaching on emptiness comes out of a set of texts called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And put it very succinctly, or very briefly, the teaching on emptiness says that the ultimate nature, the ultimate reality of everything is not some absolute permanent divine being. The ultimate nature of everything is actually the emptiness of any separate existence, right? Which means nothing exists separately, nothing exists as a permanent substance. Everything exists in dependence on everything else. This is particularly a Mahayana teaching that's an expansion and a pretty significant departure from the early tradition. Okay, I got it, Donna, thank you. And what this translates into is a remarkable kind of change in the interpretation of nirvana and its relationship to the realm of existence, samsara. In the early tradition, there was an understanding that you had to leave behind samsara in order to get to this early transcendent dimension called nirvana. But in the Mahayana tradition, precisely because everything is empty of any intrinsic, independent, substantial being, you don't have to go anywhere to get to nirvana. Samsara, in its deepest nature, is already empty of any kind of ignorance, any kind of impurities. In its deepest fundamental nature, it's already pure and enlightened. So in the Mahayana tradition, they say nirvana and samsara are not two different realms. Nirvana is samsara perceived in its truest nature. We do not have to go out of samsara to get to paradise, so to speak. We only need to perceive what it is in its deepest nature. And that also applies to us. We, as part of this realm of existence, in our deepest nature, is empty of any kind of separate being. And that, from the Mahayana perspective, means we're already primordially pure of all ignorance and all clinging attachments. We're already fully enlightened Buddhas in our deepest nature. And this teaching is called Buddha nature. We simply do not see this because we've been so conditioned, right, to believe that the ego self, the narrowly constructed idea of a me, is real and that is the center of reality. When in fact, what I am encompasses the whole of everything that possibly exists, right? Now, I want to end by just looking at this picture here. This is another depiction of Avalokiteshvara, and it's a Tibetan depiction of Avalokiteshvara And it's used in this particular illustration. This is supposed to be used as a meditational deity, meaning in the Tibetan tradition, a practitioner would come to this picture and they would use it to visualize themselves and all living beings as Avalokiteshvara. Why? Because it's there to help us to connect to the reality of our primordially enlightened nature. There is no dualistic separation between the ultimate and the ordinary, between Avalokiteshvara and a fully liberated, enlightened Buddha and ourselves. It is our deepest nature. To summarize then, what we see in the development of the Buddhist tradition are images and ideas about the ultimate that reject any notion of an absolute divine being, and instead insist that the present ordinary reality, including ourselves, is in its depth nothing other than the ultimate reality, empty of separation and full of perfection. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Leon and Wanjie, for sharing, gosh, a lot of the truth and wisdom of your traditions. Let's now go into our breakout groups, and those will be 20 minutes. Here's the question. And we'll put it in the chat, but what did you hear in either presentation that struck you, that enriched you, that challenged you? So what did you hear, either from Leon or from Wanjie, that struck you, enriched you? That's one of the goals of the series. Were you enriched, or were you challenged? We have 10 minutes now to hear from your groups, how your conversation went. Is there something from your group that any of you would like to share with the whole group? Kathy, are you talking? You're muted if you are.
I'm there. No, I was talking to myself. I was just trying to find the unmute. So,
Okay.
Tom bought me a new laptop, but I couldn't figure out how to do Zoom, so I'm on my phone again. So.
Okay.
Well, maybe the lack of people jumping up here means that most of the groups felt about the way we did, which was, wow, it just was
Right.
an awful lot of information to absorb. And we're all just kind of trying to process it and thinking we want to listen to them both again. So.
Thank you.
Well, in our group, I was thinking of how very different the perceptions were from the indigenous culture's spiritual belief and the Buddhist, because from what Leon was saying, I mean, the indigenous ones, just with the 3 examples she used of particular tribes, they were always relating to what was around them, to the animals, the plants. They used these figures as symbols of a larger reality. And it seems like human behavior in turn, whether creative or destructive, feeds back into the ecology of the world around them, where they bear responsibilities. But the other talk from a Buddhist perspective seems so austere and removed from any concept of we are interacting, we are doing, we are causing, we are agents that accomplish things, and we have to choose moral. There's the concept of moral righteousness. Anyway, I thought it seemed so divorced from the concrete things that we perceive around us. But then one of our partner discussed and said, no, he saw them with a lot of commonalities. So, that just shows there's richness there, doesn't it?
Yeah, I saw some commonalities too, and I would like to even relate it more to the experience of Jesus, which we don't have time to do. And our speaker didn't have time to talk about engaged Buddhism, where the Buddhists have tried so hard in recent years to really be out there serving their neighbors in active ways. And I was in a group of only 2, but we were talking about trying to liberate people from suffering and how that's such a big concern in our world. And that if we really ever achieved any measure of enlightenment, we wouldn't be so polarized in our culture. We're so unable really to converse with each other and reach across that divide somehow. We're clinging to our own message, our own sense of righteousness somehow.
That does seem like a kind of striving, though. And so I wonder how that fits in, Wanjay. Yes, Wanjay, with, to be anxious about, to be trying, to find it deplorable, to feel sad. Those are all things that it seems like Buddhism wants us to practice, not giving into, not being part of. And it can only be unhelpful if we do. And that's hard for me to get my mind around.
Our little group was, we appreciated both of the speakers. Whoops. We appreciated both of the speakers very much. And we're awed by, in both the Native American tradition and the Buddhist, of how they see reality and nature and human beings, everything's so connected and alive in interaction. And when we're healthy, when we're the healthiest, we're connected.
That's right. Yeah.
And we had a sense of awe about that.
Thank you, Fran. Anyone else?
I think Richard Rohr has drawn connections for me with the no self and the true self. That's another conversation that's interesting with the Buddhists and the Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that struck me between the Buddhists and the Christians is the salvation, saving, reaching nirvana yourself. And then when you really become super Buddha or whatever that term was, it was really for everyone, for others. Yeah. And I felt like we, through our Christian learning, salvation was individual. It was for me to get to heaven. It was for me to be saved. It was for me. And now that concept is opening up for me and for many, I think, with the new cosmology, that it's for all of us together that we have salvation, not just through individual people.
Right.
Leon, Wanjay, before we go into the questions, does either of you want to respond to some of what we've just heard, some of the reflections that you just heard?
Yeah, I first thank you all so much for such deep reflections. There was a question that was directed directly at me, so maybe I don't know if I should address it now or.
Sure, go ahead.
I couldn't get her name. the name on the Zoom says Fink.
Lynn, that's you, Lynn.
Lynn.
Go
okay.
ahead.
So I don't know if I understood you correctly, but I understood the question to be that how do we make sense of the Buddhist kind of emphasis on having to refrain from engaging with the world, and doesn't that lead to, you know, kind of disengagement with ordinary, everyday, concrete reality? Am I understanding your question? Okay, so what the tradition, Buddhist tradition, discourages from doing is acting on the basis of a small ego. That's the root problem. So we need to find a way of acting from a larger, deeper ground than just the limited small ego that we create because we're afraid of impermanence and we want lasting security. So if we can, so this is why the teachings around how to engage properly with oneself, with other people, and with the natural environment, and with the world as a whole, the Buddha was very specific about, you know, maintaining ethical conduct, cultivating an attitude of unconditional compassion, as well as loving kindness, cultivating an equanimity, kind of an unshakable mind that's not, you know, thrown off balance by every single stimulus, and reacting to every single thing that happens to me, and cultivating a deep sense of sympathetic joy with all living beings, especially when somebody else is enjoying happiness or is progressing in some way toward the truth. So the whole thing about restraining and disengaging from the world is one part of it, and it only applies when we are acting from a motivation shaped by clinging attachment to things. And this hankering after, I have to have this, myself has to be at the center of everything. I have to have everything that supports my sense of me. That's the only way to live. That's the only thing that's real to me. That kind of mindset, if that is how we see the world and ourselves and others, we need to cut that. We need to undercut that first. Find a different way of relating to self, relating to others, relating to world. So I hope that answers the question. So be quiet now, sorry.
Mhm. Should we go to the questions then that were submitted? Oops. This would be for you, Leon. What parallels do you see between Christianity and Lakota traditions, between Jesus' sense of Abba and the familial images and metaphors of Lakota, or perhaps between Lakota metaphors and Jesus's parables? You mentioned those a little earlier.
Sure. Well, I could actually tell a story that parallels the Jesus story. It's not quite, you know, the historical Jesus, but it's the story of two scouts that go out, instructed by Chief Standing Hollowhorn, to go find where the buffalo were, because the people were starving. And they go out in all the different directions, and they start heading east, and they come upon the hill crest, and they see something, this image of this beautiful, what appears floating towards them, this beautiful woman that is in a pure, perfectly white, pure, without any imperfections, deerskin, buckskin. And she's got bluish, shiny black hair, and her eyes are very piercing. And she floats towards them almost as if she's not walking at all. And the two scouts realize that she has this incredible beauty, but one of the scouts reaches out to touch her, almost to possess her. And he is, just by touching her, is stricken to dust and bone. The other scout realizes that this is a beauty beyond just physical, that there's this this transcendent power in her. And he essentially is, you know, afraid and says, you know, something true is coming. And she recognizes apparently this and tells him to go back to the village, to prepare the village in a ceremonial way, in a sacred way. And she will arrive from the east in 4 days. And so he goes back and they send out criers and they prepare. And so she eventually comes and she's carrying in one arm a bundle of sage, and in the other, in a bag, she's carrying a sacred pipe. And so what she does is she brings to the Lakota people the 7 sacred ceremonies, and she instructs the different groups, the grandparents, the children, the men and the women, in terms of what their roles are, and also how to live the red road, essentially. And so she's known as Te Sanwi, or the white buffalo calf woman, and she is at the center of the traditional Lakota way. She is essentially the image of the right way to live. And so you could say there are parallels between that and the story of Jesus, and in terms of the right way to live, the exemplary life. And so, yeah, I think there's some parallels. I do find you have to get into, I think it was Paula who mentioned the new cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
I think to grasp how they share a lot, as well as Buddhism, would be in terms of looking at it from the perspective of this new cosmology. The idea that religions are part of the human story, and that as part of the human story, they all offer something that's essential for people to live. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is, you know, one truth is that we should all try to embrace all these truths from these different religions. We each pick our paths. But I do think the interesting thing is one of the reasons why Indigenous people were able to adopt Christianity is because they already had this view of many different manifestations of the divine. And so, yeah, you have Jesus. Well, we have Te Sanwi. We'll bring Jesus in, you know. But where it became a problem was when Europeans started and then Americans started saying, no, you have to give up all of that and accept Jesus as your only. And that was problematic because there's no separation in way of life and worldview. The landscape, the stories, the identity is wrapped up in, you know, the person being fixed on that, in that place. And so it's hard to get, you know, to say no to that. But inevitably, most Native people are Christian today, but practicing traditional ways as well. So doing the ceremonies, but also going to church services, to mass and so forth.
So they have found ways to integrate those together without reducing.
Yes, in fact,
Either
there's a ceremony, and there is a movement it's been around for several decades called the Native American movement, and it's associated with peyote. And peyote becomes kind of the embodiment of Jesus in these ceremonies. Yeah.
There's a question about, for you, Wanjay, about the noble truths of Buddhism. How does Buddhism consider their noble truths at a time before there were humans to have this craving for self and permanence?
Yeah, that's a great question. The understanding is that there have always been multiple Buddhas because in the Buddhist understanding of cosmology, there are multiple worlds, an infinite number of worlds. And in each world, in a particular age, a Buddha can appear in order to teach the inhabitants of that world a way to freedom from suffering.
Mhm.
So in this world, we, from the Buddhist perspective, we've been blessed with Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, and his teaching was given in the form of the Four Noble Truths. So there's an understanding that, you know, in these multiple worlds, a Buddha, many different Buddhas appear and have appeared and have given these kinds of teachings in order to help sentient beings.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess to kind of, you know, summarize here, here's a question. When we learn about new traditions, we naturally want to identify similarities between what we hold true and what we're hearing as new truth from you. So what advice do you have for helping us engage fruitfully with difference as difference without reducing it down? How do we engage with plurality in what you both have described for us? Any wisdom about that?
I do a program where I take students to the Navajo Nation every spring. And one of the things that we meet several times in class before we go, and especially in our culture today, I think it was Marie Hill that mentioned the divisiveness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a concern to say the wrong thing, the concern to offend,
Mm-hmm.
to ask a question that might be offensive. It's been my experience that, and I can't speak for all Native people, but they've heard it all. So
Mm-hmm.
in many ways. And so what I encourage the students to do is, if you want to learn about Navajo people and the traditional ways, go to Navajo people and ask Navajo people.
Mm-hmm.
They will be happy to share what they are willing to share. Sometimes you may not know, if you ask in the summer to tell, and you ask them to tell a story, that they might give you a story, but it won't be a story that is of significance because it's not the time of year you tell stories. And they might tell you that. The first, you know, it's that after the full moon of the first frost. So yeah, so I would ask, that would be my encouragement, is if you want to learn, and if you're limited by travel, look for books that are authored by people of that culture.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, I think Donna, we were talking about this book, Braided Sweetgrass, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it Jane? We were talking about this book and how this author is Potawatomi Haudenosaunee, who's like Iroquois. She's speaking from a perspective of being Potawatomi today, like as a contemporary perspective, as opposed to a perspective from a time far gone. So that's my suggestion.
It was Tim.
Sorry, Tim.
Wanjay, the last word.
Oh no, I just wholeheartedly agree with what Leon said. I mean, in the Buddhist context, to really explore Buddhist communities and learn of the, you know, as much as you can about the tradition from those who understand the tradition from the inside, looking at the authoritative texts and learn from authoritative teachers of the tradition. And, you know, my own one little thing that I could just offer is maybe a good place to start is what aspect of Buddhism, you could just begin with what we talked about today. What aspect of Buddhism, you know, do you find most compelling? And just take that and begin exploring that, and let that be an opening to explore these teachings in depth.
Thank you.
And I think that will lead you to relate it to your own faith in a way that's most meaningful to you.
Yes. I don't know who stated this, whose quote this is, but to to practice Buddhism makes one a better Christian, a more authentic Christian. Does anybody know who that, Donna, do you know that?
Well, there was Paul Knitter's book, Without
Paul
Buddha,
Knitter's
I
book.
Couldn't
Yeah,
Be a
Paul
Christian.
Knitter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
has taught us a lot about that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Again, Leon and Wanjay for lots for us to think about. Donna, we're gonna do a quick commercial about our next one. This is the end of the series for 2021, but on January 19th, if you want to mark your calendars, January 19th, and we're going to shift to Wednesday nights, January and February. That one will be by Ashley Thuring, and it is contextual theology. So Ashley's specialty is on feminist theology. What else?
Black woman. Oh, wait.
Womanist.
Womanist.
Yeah, black
Feminist,
woman,
womanist.
feminist, black woman, ecology.
Eco-theology. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes, all those varieties. Yes, great. Okay, so we'll look forward to that.
Mhm.
Well, thank you again. God bless everyone. Have
Thank
a
you. Thank
peaceful
you.
night.
Thank you, Wanjay.
Yes,
Thank you,
very,
Wanjay and Leon. Thanks, everyone.
very grateful. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much.
You're with us tonight.
Good to see all of you.
Uh-huh.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Peace.